and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Kim Wei. On today's program, the Olympic Committee faces a huge decision amid one of history's greatest sports scandals, as anti-doping leaders from 14 nations call for a blanket ban on Russia from the Rio Games. And we talk to Leslie Mastorp, Vice President of the BRICS New Development Bank, on what the bank stands for and the highs and lows in the journey thus far. It is one of the traditional powerhouses of Olympic sports, but Russia's place at the 2016 Games in Rio de Janeiro hangs in the balance over the allegations of state-sponsored doping. Russia lost its appeal today against a ban on its track and field athletes going to the Rio 2016 Olympics. The Court of Arbitration for Sport has rejected the Russian Olympic Committee's appeal, which impacts 68 athletes. Separately, the International Olympic Committee is also considering calls to ban all Russian competitors from the Olympic Games following a second report into state-sponsored doping. Analysts say the possible absence of the nation's athletes at Rio would bring back memories of the Cold War era, when the U.S. boycotted the Moscow Olympic Games in the 1980s, and then Soviet Union snubbed the Los Angeles Games 4 years later.
Hanging by a moment. The International Olympic Committee is considering a ban on Russia from the Rio Games after a World Anti-Doping Agency investigation found evidence of a state-backed doping scheme back in the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. Investigators uncovered an alleged doping program involving 28 sports, both summer and winter, and ran from 2011 to 2015. It also found 312 positive tests that were intentionally covered up by Russia's Deputy Minister of Sport at the time. IOC President Thomas Bach called it a shocking and unprecedented attack on the integrity of sport and the Olympics, and vowed that the toughest sanctions will be used for everyone involved. Russia has denied all charges and strongly opposes such a ban, saying that politics should have no place in sport.
Attempts to use the Olympic Games as some kind of political weapon or pressure, and moreover boycotting of the Olympic Games. I thought that was all in the distant past.
2 years ago, Russia took home the most medals at the Sochi Winter Games, 33 medals, 13 of them gold. The country planned to send a total of 387 athletes, including 68 in track and field, to the Rio Olympics just 2 weeks away. Now, Russia's athletes face a nervous wait.
What can we do? We can really only rely on CAS and the IOC. I hope these people will take a really independent position.
The IOC said on Tuesday it would take the Court of Arbitration for Sport's ruling on the case into consideration before deciding whether to hit Russia with a blanket ban. The 28 international federations governing all the sports will meet via teleconference on Sunday to consider the issue. With just 15 days until the Games, the pressure of making the right decision is hanging heavy on the IOC's shoulders.
For more on Russia's doping scandal, we are now joined in our Beijing studio by Mr. Yan Qiang, who's founder of Score Sport. Welcome, sir.
Thanks.
Also in New York, we're having Mr. Robert Boland, professor of sports law at Ohio University. He's also the principal of Boland Sports Practice. Meanwhile, in Oxford, we are joined by Neil Clark, journalist and broadcaster. Gentlemen, welcome to the three of you. What do you make?
Thank you.
First of all, Mr. Clark,
Thank you.
the decision made by CAS about Russia's appeal. Obviously, it was rejected.
Yes, absolutely. I wasn't too surprised by that, really, because I think that what's going on now, I think there's enormous pressure put on these bodies now to rule against Russia. Because, of course, while we condemn drug cheating and we don't condone it whatsoever, and, of course, anybody found guilty of taking drugs should be banned, I think there's the geopolitical picture to consider. And only this weekend we learnt from Reuters news agency that the US Anti-Doping Agency and the Canadian Anti-Doping Agency had written to the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, urging them to ban all Russian participants at the Rio Olympics. And that was before the so-called McLaren report. into drug use. So I think that what we've got here really is, unfortunately, a geopolitical agenda which is latching on to this serious issue. And let's face it, it is a serious issue. And of course, I'm not condoning it. I think, as I said, that all athletes who have been found guilty of taking drugs should be banned. But however, I think there's politics at play here too. And I think that the IOC, which we're told will make this decision on Sunday, whether to ban all the Russian participants from the Rio Olympics, I think they're coming under enormous pressure from I think, the US and from Canada, particularly.
Well, Mr. Boland, what do you think, Professor Boland? Is it politically motivated, or at least partly politically motivated?
Well, I think the delay in making a final decision on a ban in Russia is politically motivated, and I think Russia's embarking on a doping strategy is politically motivated. I'm not sure that the doping agencies of the world are operating in this theory of politics. I think they're operating on the realm of their own credibility.
They probably is running on their own credibility, but on the other hand, what about the court's decision and the possibility that the Russian team as a whole will be banned or not from the Olympic Committee? What do you make of it? Could that be also part of the politics?
Well, it's undoubted. The ban of the track athletes is probably not entirely political, although I think the Russian Federation and Sports Ministry indulging in the doping practices that they've been accused of in the McLaren report are the part and parcel of the ban of the track athletes, of the multiple tests and the procedures that essentially have called them all into question. I think the final decision, I think CAS is operating in the realm of sport here. I think the big political question, because Vladimir Putin and the Russian state have put sport at the forefront of a global state geopolitical strategy, the decision to ban the entire Russian delegation from the Rio Games, or essentially strip them from their membership in the IOC is a great step that we haven't seen them take yet.
All right, interesting. We got two views already, Mr. Yan. As you may heard from Mr. Clark and Professor Boland, Mr. Clark seemed to argue there are some geopolitical issues behind some of the decision being made related to Russia's participation or not to the Rio Olympic Games, whether it's athlete teams or a whole delegation. However, from Professor Boland's perspective, what is politics is what Russia has been doing, and also the delay of IOC of banning Russia from the Rio Games. So what do you make of it?
I think basically there are two claims of wars or battles in regarding to the so-called government-sponsored doping scandal in regarding to Russian sport. You know, from the McLaren report perspective or the WADA perspective, you know, it's purely a kind of government-sponsored doping system in Russia. Therefore, there should be a kind of blanket boycott or kind of forbidden of Russian to enter in the Rio Olympics. But from the Russians' perspective, they claim, you know, this kind of Western and sponsored or Western-backed, you know, political war against us. Therefore, I think, you know, the two parts are just wants to, especially from the Russians' perspective, they want to make it murkier.
Do you have an opinion, or do you prefer not to have any opinion? I
don't think there will be a kind of forbid of Russian for entering the Rio Olympics. Therefore, only according to the athletics.
Well, I think what the result might be is one thing, and what about the process is also another thing that is very important, the debate itself. Just talk about the doping itself. It has been such a big issue in the modern sports.
Yeah.
Doping, gambling, corruption, all of these have been frequently mentioned over the past few years. Professor Boland, of course you're coming from the United States. I'm not saying anyone should be responsible for this, not even you, of course. But there's an interesting example that we would like to remind our viewers as well. 13 years ago, the U.S. was also in the center of a similar doping scandal, as the United States Olympic Committee was accused of covering up drug use by athletes. Dr. Wade Exum, director of the drug control for the USOC from the year 1991 to 2000, released more than 30,000 pages of documents to Sports Illustrated. Of course, that is a magazine. Exum said that there were more than 100 positive drug tests for American athletes from the year 1998 to the year 2000, including 18 who tested positive at the Olympic trials. but competed in the games anyway. However, there has been accusation coming from USOC calling the accusations baseless. Having said that, though, Professor Boland, how much do we know about doping, whether by individual athletes or by teams, by delegations at various Olympic Games? To what extent do you think athletes on an individual basis should be punished?
Well, I don't think athletes should be punished as much as is feasibly possible. I think athletes live on to some version of a slippery slope with regard to doping when it's widespread, which we know it is, when it's multinational, which we know it is, and when in certain cases it's part of a larger global statecraft, the way it was for the nations of the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. So we know a good bit. I think the fall of East Germany, and the Western countries do it commercially in their own way. So we know a good bit now. I think we know a good bit more because of this scandal. So it's not. I guess I should say it's not something that's included in any country. The Western nations do it commercially because there isn't really a national strategy behind it. But there is a pervasiveness of it, and we always, as testers, seem to be behind the athletes and the coaches who are and the doctors who are pushing this strategy.
Right.
So we're always behind, and I think this is a case where WADA, the World Anti-Doping Organization, and the Canadian Anti-Doping Organization, the U.S. Anti-Doping Organization, are trying to push for the credibility of their practice, and they're true believers in what they do.
Okay. Mr. Clark, what do you think?
Well, I don't really hold to that line what Professor Boland just said. I think that, as we said, we've seen this leaked letter from the US Anti-Doping Agency and the Canadian one pushing for a complete blanket ban on all Russian athletes and sports people at the Olympics, regardless of whether they're track and field or not. So I think that shows us the agenda here, and the agenda, unfortunately, from the US and Canada seems to be to want to get Russia totally in the sin bin altogether. And of course, there's also been calls for Russia to be stripped of the 2018 Football World Cup. What's that got to do with it? What's that got to do with doping? And yet we're coming up, we've got John McCain, the US politician, the right-wing neocon, saying that Russia should be stripped now of the World Cup in 2018, the Football World Cup. And that shows you that these people are latching on to this very serious doping issue as a means of furthering their anti-Russian agenda, because football is not to do with this. What's football got to do with these latest allegations?
All right, let me go back to Professor Boland just for a second to respond to what Mr. Clark just said, and then I'll come back to Mr. Yan Qiang because he has a lot to say about soccer. Certainly, that's something very close to his heart. So, Professor Boland, briefly respond, please.
Well, I'm the last person that should ever defend the motives of WADA or USADA, the U.S. Anti-Doping Organization. And I do believe that there's been an overreach, at least calling for an entire ban on the Russian delegation to the Olympics. I would be shocked, and I know we'll go there in future questions probably, to be shocked if the IOC takes that bold a step. And I think that would be harmful to the athletes involved, and it might be harmful to the Olympic movement as we think about it. I have no insight into what the call for soccer is, but I do think that the muscle that Vladimir Putin has used in statecraft, in terms of getting the World Cup, in terms of hosting the Sochi Olympics, and then in whatever statecraft was involved in their doping, certainly is part and parcel of this. I feel like there is geopolitics involved, no doubt. I'm not sure that in the West we're necessarily thinking of it that way, except for in a few cases where it's opportunistic.
Okay. Interesting issues. There are several things already involved. One is whether individual athletes should be punished for something a team did. Possibly the individual athletes are not aware of it. This is one thing. The other thing is whether punishment in one field, for example, track and field, should be extended to the whole delegation of Russia, or even to other sports which has nothing to do with it.
The overall view of all Russian sports.
Okay, go ahead. So what do you make of all of this debate, one layer after another, Mr. Yan? You have to make a stand now.
I think we can only make decisions based on the evidence that we can find at the moment, according to the McLaren report. If all those players or sports people, taking the kind of Dutchess cocktail, which was proven to be spiked, with all this doping stuff inside, then those individual players or sports people should be banned. How can you accuse the Russian state they should not be hosting the World Cup in 2018. And even though there were some bans of some Russian sports officials of entering their sports minister of entering the Rio Olympics, I don't think that's the way of solutions of getting over,
Why not? They would say, well, if it is state sponsored, let's
them,
just ban the officials, they would say.
If the ban of all those officials of entering international sports stage, so how can you communicate with them in the future? You're just building up the wall, another Cold War in sports. And, I'm really worried about these trends of in which direction it's leading. Now it's Russia, then who will be the next target?
Of course, we could not compare.
Could be China.
Yeah, I agree with you, Neil.
We probably would not be able to compare the duck with the goose at this moment, to compare what is happening now to what happened during the Cold War era, because we're in a very different time. But certainly the taste of it, at least at this moment, and the rhetorics being used reminded people of things happened more than 30 and even 40 years ago.
I have one opinion. I think the Russian people, especially the politicians, including President Putin, I think they overreacted a little bit. They reacted in a very political way, a very geopolitical way, saying, there was another conspiracy.
All right.
We
could talk about the Russian side also, but they are not now to decide the fate of their athlete, but rather the IOC. So I think that is even more important for today's topic. Let me go to you, Mr. Clark. What do you think? What can be the next? First of all, we probably need to emphasize every question one by one. Now, at this moment, should the athletes be banned, blanket ban, including those that are on the track and field?
Be a blanket ban. No.
Okay.
No, I think it'd be totally wrong to have a blanket ban. And as you said, we had this similar situation happening about 15 years ago with the US, with the whistleblower there about the drugs program that the US was supposed to have been carrying out. And there was no talk of a ban or a blanket ban of US athletes. And so I think it would be wholly wrong to have a blanket ban. I think that this new
Mr. Clark, I have to say, you can't say, well, because the U.S. athletes were not being punished, and therefore all the other athletes who are taking doping should not be punished in the future.
No,
you can't just use that precedent.
Of course not.
So what is your argument?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at all. I'm talking about a blanket ban. I totally agree that any athlete, whether they're Russian, Chinese, German, Finnish, you name it, any athlete that's been found to be taking drugs should be banned. But what is wrong is that using this as a blanket ban, it's very important to remember this so-called McLaren report, it's not really a report. It's an indictment, it's a charges list. And Mr. McLaren didn't get the views of the Russians, didn't get the Russian testimony for various reasons. And so we really want a thorough investigation in which the Russians can put their side of the thing. Because it relies heavily on the testimony of the whistleblower, the head of the anti-doping agency in Russia. Very much the McLaren report is based on this one man's testimony. So let's get a bit more forensic, let's get a bit more judicial, and let's have a thorough investigation and not just hold Russia fully guilty when we haven't really heard the Russian point of view, the Russian side of the case, as it were. So yes, if I totally agree with you that any athletes found to be taking drugs or have been taking drugs should be banned, of course. But I think a blanket ban would be totally unfair, because you've got to think these athletes have been working hard for this Olympics. This is their life. They've been training for this for 4 years. And for them to be deprived of this opportunity to compete in Rio because some other people from their country have taken drugs, I think is very wrong. And I think we've got to be fair in this.
Okay, Mr. Yan, but on the other hand, they would say, well, if we don't ban them as a whole, then many people will repeat the same mistakes. We have to make the punishment really severe for all the others to remember.
The accusation now is that it's not about the individual Russian sports people being doped. It's about kind of so-called government-sponsored doping system. I think that's the accusation from WADA and also. But how many evidence do we have?
It's not been proven, has it?
Exactly. I agree with you.
That's my point.
I agree with you.
It's an allegation.
Okay, all right. Mr. Clark, you have to let others talk also. We heard your voice already, so Mr. Yan.
I think we have kind of more comprehensive investigation, held by international forces, including those who called for kind of blanket ban to further the investigation of this. Of course, there is not enough time, before the Rio Olympics. So I don't think there should be a blanket ban.
But at this moment, Professor Boland, the CAS already ruled, and the IOC was suggesting that they would take into consideration the CAS result. So what would that mean?
Well, I think it's exactly that. They will take into consideration. I would be shocked if the IOC essentially decertified the Russian Olympic delegation as a whole, and I think they would get great pushback from some of the other individual sports under the Olympic movement, the Gymnastics Federation, perhaps the Boxing Federation, and a few others if that were to happen. I also think it would be an unprecedented step for the IOC. So I don't think that is going to happen, even though it is something they're going to consider. I do think the key issue here is what the McLaren report points out is a pervasive state-sponsored program of doping, and that's a harder one to get around. So basically, it makes any athlete's test in Russia tested by the Russian lab into question. So I think if there's an avenue to get athletes from Russia who've trained elsewhere, test positive or test negative elsewhere into the Olympics, I think the Olympic movement should be looking very strongly at that. Because again, the IOC really needs to not make this an political issue at the risk of the games again.
But on the other hand, Mr. Clark, I don't want to feed ammunitions to you. Has sport getting ever more political or less political since the end of the Cold War?
Much more, I'm afraid. I think we've already seen this. Even before this doping issue came up, we saw a very strong ongoing attempt, as I said, to strip the Football World Cup away from Russia for various reasons we've heard. We've heard it's to do with, well, there might have been corruption in how Russia got this up in the first place. Then when we had the European Football Championships in France last month, we had some violence between Russian fans who did behave badly, some of them, against English fans. And then we had another call saying, look, Russia's got some bad football hooligans, therefore they shouldn't host the World Cup. And as I said, we've had US politicians weighing in on this one. So this shows us that it's not just about doping. If this doping did not exist, or even if we didn't have this doping scenario, there'd still be other pretexts, I think, for calling from the Western countries against Russia. So I think it's just the latest pretext.
Mr. Yan.
Yeah, I have a question for both of our guests here today.
You cannot have a question for both of your guests.
For Neil.
Unfortunately, you have to express your own views.
You know, I want to jump out of this discussion for the moment, and I want to ask you, how do you think about the future lies for China?
Well, that's a little bit overstretched, I have to say, Mr. Yan. You always come up with some abrupt questions. That's always a habit of your participating in a program. But before we go, I think there's one question that's very important. That is, how to make sure the athletes' rights are being protected if they are working hard for their sports. And at the same time, how to make sure international system as a whole that doping issues, whether it's state-sponsored or individually practiced, be fewer and fewer cases as we see it. Professor Boland, very briefly from you.
WADA needs to really establish independent protocols around the world and test independently at events. That's part of the problem. It was the out-of-season, out-of-competition testing that the Russian laboratory is accused of having done so poorly. So I think when athletes compete in cycle, we should test more regularly. I'm not the biggest advocate for testing or a testing policy because I think we'll always be behind. But I think that's the best assurance, along with the current CAS procedures, to protect athletes' rights.
Mr. Yan?
Yes, I think we need to gather as many evidence as possible in regarding to this Russian one. We have to clean up this question first.
And Mr. Clark?
Well, I would agree with Professor Boland. I think I couldn't agree more, actually, that we need more independent drug testing outside of the countries themselves. And I think we ought to really, governments are trying to use sport as a way of promoting themselves around the world. Let's get back to the individuals competing. Let's not have this sort of nationalistic kind of Olympics when it's all about how many countries win medals. Let's get back to the basics of the Olympic movement, really. I think that's very important, too.
It should be about the sports and only
it should be, not politics.
Sports itself. Thank you so much, Robert Boland, Neil Clark, and Mr. Yan Qiang in Beijing. I'm sorry I didn't let you to ask that question, but we're running out of time for now.
I will talk to Neil
we'll leave it that for some other occasions.
Next week.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. We speak one-on-one with Leslie Mastorp, Vice President of the BRICS New Development Bank, for an insider's take on what sets the bank apart and the challenges thus far. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. 1 year ago, members of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, launched a new development bank in Shanghai. It is expected to become a sustainable and innovative complement to the existing global banking system and bring about new developments.
The idea of setting up a bank for the BRICS originally came from renowned economists Nicholas Stern and Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz in 2011. The 5 host countries, Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa, provided $50 billion as its startup capital, with an equal share to ensure equal voting rights. The New Development Bank, or NDB, aims to supplement the existing international financial system in a healthy way and explore innovations in governance models. South African officials say the NDB intends to be environmentally friendly. The main focus of the bank will be funding infrastructural and cross-border projects in BRICS countries.
And on the 1-year birthday of the BRICS New Development Bank, I talked to the vice president of that bank, Mr. Leslie Mastorp. He shared with us about his visions of the Young Institute. Tell us about this green bond. How did it work?
We raise funding, we raise finance from the debt capital markets, and we then sign off that all of the projects, how we use the proceeds, will be towards projects that are green, that are reducing carbon in the economy.
But then that would mean the priorities of all those countries and projects asking for support from a New Development Bank would have to change the focus.
In most of our economies, especially the energy-intensive ones like India, Brazil, China, and so on, all of them have a focus on ensuring that they change the direction of the economic policy. So there's absolute consensus amongst the 5 members that sustainability is key. But we will also issue general bonds, right? When governments provide a strong impetus for the project pipeline, for example. So let's say in China, at the moment we are supporting a project in Pudong that is building 100 megawatts of rooftop solar, right? So industrial scale solar photovoltaic, about 100 megawatts worth of power we will be providing to Shanghai, right? So what it essentially means is that we are enhancing or financing the financing part of the Chinese infrastructure projects in addition to what, let's say, China Development Bank is financing or some of the other financial institutions.
Does this mean New Development Bank is very unique among all the development banks, whether international or regional, that we've seen over the past few decades?
I think there are a few areas where the New Development Bank is different. The first area in which we're different, I would say, is that we are giving greater focus to the sustainability agenda, and as I say, our mandate has been crystallized as sustainable infrastructure. The second area, how we are trying to differentiate ourselves, is how we raise the funding. Most of the multilateral banks essentially raise their funding in US dollars and then on-lend in US dollars. In our case, because we want to develop local capital markets in our member countries, we will also raise funding in each of the markets. So let me give you a concrete example. We are launching our first bond, raising 3 billion renminbi in China. So we are raising in local currency and then lending in local currency, which means that we are reducing the foreign exchange risk. It's a very efficient way of raising funding. So what we will do as a bank is have a flexible approach to how we raise our funding, both in US dollars as well as in the local currencies of our member countries.
And the other thing, of course, is the comparison people always do between the New Development Bank, which has been having members among all the new economies, and also, for example, AIIB.
Thanks, Diane. A couple of things. Firstly, I think it's important to start with by saying that we are sister institutions. We are both headquartered in China. We were started more or less around the same time, but there are very distinct roles that we are playing. We are focused to become over time the Bank of Emerging Markets. So right now we have 5 member countries, but the Articles of Agreement of the bank makes provision that over time we will allow in new members. But the character of the bank will always remain emerging market focused. So the legal agreements of the bank makes provision that 80% of the equity will be owned by emerging markets and 20% has been set aside for developed industrialized countries, right? So that is our character. AIIB is very different, firstly, in terms of its composition. It already has 57 member states with, I think by the last count, probably close to 40 countries on a waiting list from what Mr. Jin announced at the annual meeting about 2 weeks ago. So they are a much bigger institution with respect to members, right? Secondly, the geographies don't overlap. Obviously, our member countries are all members of the AIIB as well. So Brazil, Russia, India and so on, they're all members of the AIIB, and therefore there is no real sort of overlap. Geographically, right now we are focused only on the 5 member countries and investing in there.
Given the status of the economy and given the fact that a New Development Bank is being headquartered in China, and given the fact that China has been a great contributor to the New Development Bank, and many would suspect whether the New Development Bank's project would be mainly focusing on China. How would you respond to them?
The other, I should add, the other key difference also between ourselves and AIIB is that in our case, China is a contributor, meaning it is also one of the investors in the bank, having put in capital, but China is also a borrower. In other words, China is already borrowing. In the case of AIIB, China is the controlling shareholder and China is a non-borrowing member, which means that AIIB will not be investing in infrastructure projects here. That is a very key distinction. But then I think it's important to emphasize that the New Development Bank is run on a very different principle to many other international institutions. We have 5 members with an equal say in the running of the institution. At the governance level, our board of directors comprise of the 5 ministers of finance, each with an equal say. May I remind you that China is 30, 31, 32 times bigger than South Africa, for example. But we'll be putting in the same 2 billion of capital that China has put in. But China is a significant economy and it's a significant player without a doubt. We are headquartered here. China has played a very important enabling role for us, for example, through People's Bank of China to do our first bond issue here. So it has played a much more critical role because of our location and the fact that we are headquartered here. But it is, equals amongst the other countries.
Equals are important. At the same time, democracy always means sometimes difficulties for decisions. So that means for managers like you, do you have to consult with everybody and build a consensus? Is it easy?
Look, it is always challenging to bring different perspectives towards one common agenda. But I think the model that we have experimented with is still unfolding. It's a consensus-driven, consensus-seeking model. So we try to reach sufficient consensus before we take a decision. So it's not merely a matter of simple majority. You have 5 members, 3 out of 5, that is sufficient, you ignore the other 2 members. No. If we have only 3 member states wanting to go a particular direction, we would be working on ensuring that we can persuade, convince, nudge the other 2 members towards that position, or try to blend and find ways to bring on board the considerations from the other 2 members. But it's an evolving model.
The name BRICS came from the acronym for an association of 5 major emerging national economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The 5 nations, with over 40% of the world's total population and roughly 1/3 of the world's land area, have a combined GDP accounting for about 1/5 of the world total. Each country has its own comparative advantages, including human and natural resources. Yet recent years have seen economic slowdown in nearly all 5 members of the BRICS. Russia is in a recession as oil price tailspin and sanctions weigh heavy. China's growth hit a record low in 2015. Brazil is struggling with its worst recession since the 1930s. With growth being such a challenge to all 5 nations, most remain cautiously optimistic of the future.
I'd say, firstly, it's important to note that the overall macroeconomic and fiscal conditions of some of the BRICS countries have changed since the founders came up with the idea of the New Development Bank. Way back 3-4 years ago, when the idea of the bank was born, the emerging markets, certainly Brazil, South Africa, China, etc., were seen as the darlings of global growth, if you like. With the exception of India, that has obviously changed now, right? But in each of these markets, you have very sophisticated financial markets already. So we pretty much see ourselves as playing a complementary role to what each of these governments are already to deepen the capital markets, to broaden the investor base in the bond markets. So we are really just a cherry on top in addition to what they are already doing.
How well informed you have to be about the latest development and the latest debate inside the Chinese capital market for you to make a final decision. After all, it's not your own money. It's those member countries' money, and you have to be extremely responsible for that.
Absolutely. As an institution, we have to be financially sustainable. As a bank, we are focused and driven on development impact. So we're not necessarily profit-driven, if you like, but all of the profits that we generate will go into reserves and add to the capital base and gets further reinvested. So the first point to make is that we want to build a sustainable long-term institution that will contribute to economic development in each of these 5 markets. With respect to China, Chinese economy and in the financial markets, China is experiencing significant transformation as we speak. As you know, the renminbi was included in the special drawing rights of the IMF, which means that over the next number of years, and it will take a very long time, because there needs to be a greater opening up, there needs to be a lot of structural reforms to ensure that the Chinese that the Chinese currency, the renminbi, internationalize. Renminbi is already a significant currency of trade, but for it to become a reserve currency will take a very long time because the markets are dominated by US dollar. Okay, but we believe that we are contributing to the internationalization of the renminbi, which is part of the overall agenda of the Chinese government.
As you said, Leslie, it used to be the darlings of the world economy driving the growth, but now it seems that every economy among your member countries are having their own issues. Of course, all the other developed economies have their own issues as well. Having said that, though, what would that mean for your job?
The first point to make is that the institution, the New Development Bank, was set up with a very long-term agenda. So when I say long-term, I'm talking about 20, 30, 40-year horizon. The cyclical macroeconomic or fiscal situation that's happening in a particular moment in time right now is relevant but doesn't shape the overall context, right? We are experiencing a economic context now where commodity prices have significantly dropped off, prices of oil and gas, if you like, which affects the Russian economy a great deal. The Brazilian economy is in deep recession. The Chinese economy has slowed down. And because many of our countries are strong trading partners with China, that has impacted heavily on them as well. So all of that has changed. However, as I said, these are short-term cyclical dynamics. We believe that all of the strong underlying growth drivers like urbanization, like demographics, like the need for new infrastructure, all of the drivers that propelled these BRICS countries to the forefront of emerging markets are still there, inherent in the very fabric and structure of the economies. So we believe that these countries will come out of this cyclical downturn. We obviously study very closely what's happening in each of these markets.
On the other hand, we've seen issues, not just with these member countries of the New Development Bank, but also worldwide. You have dramatic political and geopolitical changes. In Europe, you got Brexit. We still don't know what's going to be the impact. In the U.S., of course, racial tensions, presidential elections brought out a lot of issues. Asia-Pacific region as well. You got South China Sea tension, Korean Peninsula as well. None of these would directly have an impact on the book that you have in hand about how much money and the mandate of yours. But still, it's going to have an indirect impact. Uncertainty.
Look, it's a very hard question to answer in a few minutes, but I think you've synchronized it well in the sense that what all of those situations produce is uncertainty. And markets don't like uncertainty. However, as a bank, all we can do is to study very closely these macro situations and see how it might impact on our ability, for example, to raise capital. We believe, though, that there are always also arbitrage opportunities. Sometimes when there's currency, when currencies depreciate, let's say the US dollar depreciates, it creates opportunities in other currencies. Right now, for example, we are looking at local currencies. So I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that we can only study these situations and see what impact it might have.
Leslie Mastorp, the Vice President of the New Development Bank. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.